Ah, yes. Remember my original top 10 worst video games from 1995 to 2011? Remember how loved that video was? Well, I'm here to do a more sensible list. The last couple of years has brought us some great games. It's also brought us some unbelievable messes that shouldn't even be sitting on store shelves. Let's take a look at my top 10 worst video games from 2011 to 2014. Remember, this list is of my choices, so if you don't agree with some of it, please don't get angry. In fact, I would love to see what your top 10 list would be. Well, let's not waste any more time. Let's get started. Number 10. Sonic Boom: Rise of Lyric. How exactly are we supposed to feel about the Sonic character after all of these years? The character that once stood as mighty as Mario is now one of many of gaming's classic characters that has fallen into the unknown. A lot of people aren't even paying attention to when Sonic games are being released anymore. It seems as though recent Sonic games have tried to be overly ambitious but haven't had the budget to complete those ambitions. A lot of Sonic games have been released appearing to be half finished, and this is the case with Rise of Lyric. Gameplay-wise, it's definitely interesting, combining the traditional speed platforming stages that we're all familiar with in this series. However, more boss battles, combat, and exploration stages were thrown in too. Everything is just off for a Sonic game. The speed platforming should make you feel at home, but ungodly frame rate issues keep them from being as good as they could have been. Add to that level designs that constantly repeat, and for this generation that is just unacceptable. So overall, will the Sonic character ever return to prominence in the video game world? At this rate, I don't see it happening anytime in the near future. Number 9. Steel Battalion Heavy Armor. Say hello to our first Kinect game on the list, and trust me, it will not be the last. Released by Capcom, which already nearly brings me to tears that such a legendary company could create something so abysmal. Now, the game has been panned for its story, but that's the least of our worries here. Yeah, the story is lame, the whole microbe-destroying computer storyline is a bit hokey for a game like this, but I can tolerate it for the most part. However, the characters suck. The characters have no personality, and in today's world of gaming, that is just inexcusable. If Mario is allowed to have personality in today's world, then soldiers should definitely have personality. Then there are the controls, which are the most unresponsive motion controls ever. This game didn't come early in the Kinect's life either. This was technology that was pretty established for the most part and was not the first Kinect game to be released by Capcom. This was just an unfortunate failure by Capcom and developer From Software. This was a valid concept that unfortunately should have been left a concept and nothing else. Number 8. Star Trek. What better way to follow up our first Kinect game on this list than with our first movie license game, and a wonderfully horrible way to kick off this genre is with Star Trek. Now, I know most people don't get excited over movie license games, but I was actually looking forward to this. Star Trek leaves so much room for a good game, or at least a good story for a video game. Also, the advertisements presented far more hype than any other movie license game that I've ever played, even going as far as bringing Star Trek legend William Shatner into the advertisements. All this hype and all of these advertisements couldn't help cover up that when you played it, you were playing a generic third-person shooter, a clearly unfinished one at that. Now, I'll give Digital Extremes credit for wanting to avoid the standard movie-based video games concept and choosing not to follow the movie's storyline and creating their own story along the way. But if they were going to do that, they should have just kept working on it and released it at a much later date than the movie. The story is interesting, but it was not brought to clear perfection due to the time constraints of Bandai Games wanting the game out during the movie's release. However, not only is the story unfinished, but so is the game's look in general, with an amazing amount of graphical pops and animations and environments with unfinished parts and textures. Also, I would like to think that the 360 and PS3 era are beyond the days of characters walking through each other. Yeah, I can let a couple occasions slide, but when it's frequent, that's a problem. So overall, it sounded like a great idea that was ruined by it being released as a movie-based game when it was clear that its story wasn't. This could have been so much more than what it became. Number 7. SelfDefense Training Camp. In terms of concept, this is probably the dumbest on the list, and unfortunately the game lives up to all levels of stupid it could live up to. How would you like to learn self-defense? Would you like to learn through a real-life instructor who has been teaching for many years, or from a video game that can't even get the concept of motion controls down correctly? This was just a horrible idea from the beginning. Not only do the characters move like robots instead of human beings, but the motion controls hardly respond. There's really not much to summarize. It doesn't even qualify as a cheap way to learn self-defense. Number 6. Aliens Colonial Marines. This, to me, like every other Aliens fan out there, just came off as not only as a bad game, but the biggest disappointment. Colonial Marines have been in development since 2001. What was supposed to be a PS2 game wound up being scrapped and placed on hold until Sega jumped on board with Gearbox Software selected to develop it, and turned this game into an Xbox 360 and PS3 game. However, many fans began to think that the game was either delayed or canceled because after the game was announced in 2008, the game saw little to no promotion in almost a 3-year time span. It finally saw a trailer in 2011, which looked actually really good, and the previews for the game looked promising. But Colonial Marines proved to be another game where all it was nothing but false advertising, and I mean to an unbelievable extent. So much so that there was actually lawsuits filed against Sega and Gearbox for releasing demos at E3 that weren't even close to the final product. Sega was actually so embarrassed by the lawsuit and was clearly guilty, so they were paying over $1 million just to get out of it. Colonial Marines is filled with bugs. Also, the gameplay is not what you would expect from a game like this. First of all, what should have been a 100% human versus aliens game, you know, like the movies it's representing, instead they have you fighting humans for over half of the game. The AI is remarkably incompetent and sometimes unresponsive. I can get by the human characters' incompetence, but the aliens were not this stupid in the movies. In fact, the movies went a long way to show the intelligence of these characters. Gearbox seemed to go out of their way to go against everything the movies did. It was changes like this that made me really wish that the game had remained on the PS2, because the screenshot from the unfinished PS2 version looked more like an Alien game than this game did. For a game that calls itself Aliens, there aren't really a lot of aliens. Overall, Aliens Colonial Marines is the perfect example on why you should never believe all the hype. Number 5. Fighter Within. Remember those old interactive fighting games for the Sega CD? Well, welcome to the Kinect equivalent to that, except guess what? This one is even more unresponsive. I flat out hate the Kinect. This was an Xbox One game too, and yet the Kinect controls are like what they were back when they were first introduced for the first year or so on the Xbox 360. There's nothing like playing a fighting game where you're throwing punch after punch after punch, and yet your character might throw one or none at all. Also, to add to the fatal flaws of this game, it's a fighting game that's only single player. Yeah, do you really want to be the only one in your house playing this, or standing in a room with all of your friends sitting around you? So overall, I've reached the point where I just want to avoid all Kinect games. Number 4. The Walking Dead Survival Instinct. This was just flat out disappointing. Unlike movies, hit television shows don't suffer from time constraints as often. This was the reason to think that a Walking Dead game would be awesome. The series seems perfectly fit for a game, there's no doubt about that, and zombie games in general are usually fairly decent. Yeah, there are a few terrible games, but the genre for the most part has been solid over the last decade. However, this does not include Survival Instinct, which tries to be realistic with the zombie franchise, adding more stealth missions and actually giving you vehicles that run out of gas. One of very few games in recent years that I've seen try to pull that off. What this creates is possibly one of the most boring zombie games ever created. I'm serious, folks. You're going to need to be either on a bet or running off of 5-hour energy to make it through this train wreck. Add to this one of the best written shows on television, and it has the most lazy story that they could have come up with for a video game. Such a well-written show, and they chose to go with a generic and boring storyline. This was so unfortunate. The Walking Dead is a classic show, and to see a game that could have been complex and amazing turn out to be so simplistic and broken is a shame. Number 3. The Slaughtering Grounds. Yes, an independent title does make it onto this list, and for this one, for more reasons than one. I mainly played this game because of Jim Sterling's review of it, which is probably the reason why most others played it. Made by independent video game developer Imminent Uprising, it's a simple-looking game that has you roaming around an environment taking down as many zombies as you can. It's not a bad concept. I'll give Imminent Uprising this. It actually sounds like fun. Unfortunately, sounding like fun and actually being fun are two separate things, and unfortunately, the latter was not on their to-do list for this game. The aiming of the guns is sporadic. 90% of the graphics are clearly copied and pasted from other sources, like the blood that appears on the screen, which Sterling managed to find on Google. The environment can pass for N64 quality, and I would consider that a good thing if the environment didn't feel like an eyesore after a half hour of playing in it. The trees look like they were images that were pasted there and are lifeless. Also, there's the difficulty. I don't mind difficult games, but when it's the flaws of the game that make it difficult, then we have a problem. Its slow-to-react gun and sporadic aiming caused me to die so many times. So overall, it's a valid concept that needed more than a $5 budget to work off of, which is clearly the budget that Imminent Uprising was working off of. Number 2. Rambo the video game. To add to this miserable list of movie licensed games, this was one that was released 30 years after the actual first 3 movies. In today's gaming world and graphical enhancements, a Rambo game sounds amazing. It sounds like a great idea to go off of because the series can easily be translated into a video game and used as a platform to continue the story outside of the films, similar to Ghostbusters the video game. However, Rambo is an unholy mess. It doesn't bother to create any sort of story of its own. Instead, it takes specific moments from the first 3 movies and you reenact them throughout the game. You reenact them incorrectly throughout the game with a gameplay that is 100% rail shooter. Don't get me wrong, I have nothing against rail shooters. They can actually be quite fun if they're done correctly, which Rambo is not. The graphics are horrendous, with terrible-looking character models that wouldn't pass inspection for an old PS2 game. The hit detection and cover is faulty and is constantly changing throughout the game, and the music repeats non-stop, making you want to listen to the game in silence throughout its duration. Enemies that shoot perfectly and rarely miss and are a pain in the ass to defeat, and there's another problem, but I think I'll let Joe explain that one better.
Or how about just fuck all that and just let the player get past your stupid bullshit, but then crash the game with bugs just before he wins?
I managed to get through the game in 3 hours, and the short length wouldn't bother me much if the game had any sort of replay value, which it doesn't. If you're going to make your game short, fine, but give us a reason to at least want to go back to it. Rambo the video game was just Reef Entertainment's attempt to cash in on a franchise, or worse yet, their way of cashing in on Sylvester Stallone because his career is doing well again. All I can say is Reef Entertainment can go straight to hell after this. And number 1. Ride to Hell Retribution. If GTA ever spawned a redheaded stepchild that no one wanted to see, this would be it. I think it's safe to say that Ride to Hell is easily the most unpolished, unfinished, and uninteresting game in history. Actually, I take that back. It's interesting only because of how unfeasibly bad it is. I bought Ride to Hell out of pure curiosity. The game was getting hammered by critics like no other game that I've ever seen hit stores. Surely it could not have been as bad as people were making it out to be. And guess what? It lived up to all of its reviews. It's not just its horribly offensive storyline that makes it bad, it's the unfinished graphics, obviously unfinished physics, and gameplay and horrible voice acting. And again, in case I didn't mention it, a horribly offensive storyline. Everything that GTA excels at, Ride to Hell fails exponentially at. The physics are the most laughable, as the motorcycles move more like jet boats and are even worse to steer. Also, the game loves to put sex into the game. I'm talking an uncomfortable amount. It can be argued that GTA 5 did the same, but most of it was non-mission based and at the player's discretion. This game incorporates it into everything. Also, the writer of this game must hate women in general because each woman in this game are like morons. I know this is based in the late 60s, but I have a hunch that women were held in higher regards than this. In fact, I'm pretty sure women were held in higher regards in the 1800s than this game portrays them in the 1960s. This is one of those games where you can tell they were plagued by budget and couldn't fully finish the game, but would a story like this be taken any better if the game was finished? The answer to that is possibly no. Overall, Deep Silver and U-Technics should be ashamed of themselves for not only creating, but even thinking about this game. This is not a game, this is a test of the human psyche and how much it's able to endure. Well, everyone, that's my top 10 worst video games from 2011 to 2014. I hope you can at least agree on some of the games that were on my list. If not, again, I would love to see your top 10 list as well. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next time.